Our first speaker for the day is Davey. She has an MA in Instructional Technology and Media and now works in the documentation team at MongoDB. Her career focuses on training adult learners in the most in-demand tech skills. Over the course of her career, she has designed learning across modalities such as e-learning courses, I still need another coffee. Instructor-led training programs, and of course, documentation. So please welcome Davey. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Davey. As mentioned, I have an instructional design background. So I'm sort of newer to the world of documentation. And it's just been such a thrill to get to meet other documentarians over the past couple of days and to feel so welcomed. I'm a first-time speaker here. And I've noticed there's a lot of first-time speakers, so I think that really is a testament to the welcoming sense of this community. So this talk draws on instructional design principles, specifically those that pertain to visuals. And when I say instructional design, I mean the creation of learning experiences and materials with the intended purpose of supporting the acquisition and application of knowledge or skills. The title of my talk is The Visuals Your Users Never Saw. Wait, that's most of them. This is not a no-holds-barred takedown of documentation visuals, so everybody can have a nice sigh of relief there. Most of the images in these slides are ones that I've made myself, or I've chosen examples from outside the world of documentation. This is, however, a breakdown of small ways to make images more cognitively interesting to readers of docs websites so that they don't just breeze past them without taking away the important points that you've aimed to share. So the way that I'm thinking about technical writing in this presentation is technical writing as directing attention towards information. So as writers, we want to direct attention to the information that is most important and the critical points that we want our users to take away. And throughout the talk, I might use the terms users or learners, but you can think about those as your audience or the folks that come to your documentation sites. In directing information, it's important to consider something called cognitive load. I think yesterday there was a talk where someone mentioned information overload, and so cognitive load is sort of a similar concept. So cognitive load is really what a learner can feasibly process in their mind. And so this thought posits that working memory is limited. Instructional methods should consider cognitive load so as not to overwhelm learners or users. And cognitive overload leads to decreasing learning and also to errors or abandoning problems. In thinking about directing attention, we want to use learners' cognitive capacity for the core things that we want them to take away and learn. So my talk breaks down into 3 sections. The first one here is don't gloss over the visuals. This section explains why visuals shouldn't be mere afterthoughts or slick marketing materials. And we should be really thoughtful about the visuals that we add into our documentation. So reading information involves these 3 things. It involves selecting, organizing, and integrating. So when I say selecting, that means paying attention to key information in the text. Organizing involves building internal connections between the selected pieces of information. And integrating involves building external connections between new information and prior knowledge. An example of helping learners select or users select information would be like learning objectives. And another kind of concept I'm going to introduce and why this matters in terms of reading is seductive detail effect. So seductive detail effect or seductive details are entertaining bits of information that are only sort of tangentially or often not at all related to the key information you're trying to get across. And the caution with these is that readers tend to remember the seductive details over key information. And an important thing to keep in mind here is that visual appeal does not necessarily mean that the learners are taking away key information. So you may have those slick marketing visuals or images, but they might be distracting from or taking away from the key learning outcomes. So seductive details interfere with the steps in the reading process. So they interfere with that selecting, organizing, and integrating. And seductive details can be extraneous images, they could be extra text that's unnecessary, but they're really thinking about them as things that distract from or take away from the key learning aims. So not only do seductive details distract, but they have been shown to have a damaging effect on learners' problem-solving abilities. So here's an example of a seductive detail, or a seductive detail visual. What does this image make you think of? Are you thinking about the mammalian brain? Are you thinking about scanning or responding to signals in the world, or brain chemicals? I'm not sure why this very brilliant person selected a roller coaster here for this point, but these things are everywhere. I went to a random SlideShare about mammalian brain chemistry and was able to find a seductive detail in the first 3 slides. So don't worry about generating emotional interest. Focus on cognitive interest. So emotional interest is generated when we add interesting but ultimately irrelevant text or images to the material. So like that roller coaster we saw. You think that that's an emotional interest, it evokes a feeling, but actually these details are irrelevant and they make the text look better, which the thinking sometimes is that this might energize readers into paying more attention and therefore see better learning outcomes. However, this isn't the case. Cognitive interest, in contrast, posits that learning a material gets more interesting when learners understand it. So focus on things that really drive home the point and connect back to the key learning aims. So cognitive interest should help the reader form a causal chain of events. What the heck does that mean? It means that they should be able to connect the text and the illustrations and make sense of the cause and effect of the topic. Added material that promotes cognitive interest can include explanative summaries, highlighting key steps, pointing out aspects of the cause and effect chain. So the takeaway here of this section is bad visuals are not benign. They interfere with the learner's ability to build connections between new information and prior knowledge. Bad visuals, or as I've called them, or as the learning science term calls them, seductive details can confuse readers as to the key points of a chunk of information. They divert attention away from the main points such that learners cannot connect to the new information that they're getting with their prior knowledge. And other than not introducing these details at all, one way to think about them or to have them have less impact is to introduce them kind of lower in your documentation. Next up, I'm hoping to convince you why visuals are worth it. So don't just throw out the visuals because they're hard. How do we move visuals beyond decoration to be connected with the learning we want to drive? So here I'm going to draw on the research of Richard Mayer. So Richard Mayer has 12 principles of multimedia learning that acknowledges the capacity of working memory, or cognitive load, as I previously introduced, and provides guidance on how to present new information. So multimedia presentations encourage learners to engage in active learning by presenting material in words and pictures, and by making connections between the pictures and the words or the talking. Words alone tend to result in learners connecting information to other knowledge versus words and pictures, which would connect information within each other or lead learners to better understand that cause and effect chain. So instead of treating pictures as decoration, use explanative illustrations that provide multiple ways to drive home the content. help learners process information by making connections. It's not enough to just deliver information. We should also be enabling and encouraging learners to actively process that information. So these are the mayor's 12 principles here. And one quick note is that he's talking about multimedia learning in terms of e-learning, but it's really any kind of 2 types or more of media presentation. So like visuals and documentation could be considered multimedia learning. Me talking to these slides is also multimedia learning. And while there are 12 of these, I'm only going to cover 4 for the purposes of this talk today. And the 4 that I'll cover are coherence, signaling, spatial contiguity, and of course, multimedia itself. And I selected these 4 because they tie most closely to the visual elements of documentation. So the first principle I'll chat through is multimedia. And this principle states that words and pictures are better than words alone. So this is a really long blurb of how to connect to an API. It is one way to capture and share this information, but ultimately it's going to be less effective for learning. And if you have issues with this definition, please go ahead and take it up with ChatGPT. That's my digital assistant for this talk. So this is more or less the same information, but presented with words and a picture. It represents more quickly for the learner what would take much longer to read. The next principle I'm going to discuss is the coherence principle. So say we're going to provide a visual example of the definition of the concept of an API. The coherence principle emphasizes that we should eliminate extraneous information. So here, in order to process this information, you really have to follow through the flow chart. There's a lot of variables. There's a lot of yes, no, and branches. In contrast to the same visual that also teaches the concept of an API. And my recommendation here would be simplify and then add complexity as you explain. And don't be afraid to break up the visuals or the information into smaller chunks, just like you would do with text. And one quick reminder of the seductive detail effect is when adding seductive details reduces the learner's remembering key information. So again, same information shown here, but you're less likely to drive home learning of what the concept of an API is here because there's so many distractions and the message is kind of hard to decipher with the distracting details here. You might remember this joke or these memes instead of how the different components of an API work together. On to the signaling principle. Signaling is used to highlight the essential information. This can be done through text with bullet points, or it can be done through clear signals on visuals. Use signaling to add complexity. So here is an example of signaling through highlighting of text. And then here's an example of highlighting in my same API explanation. You can see I've added some highlights here in the API call and then the return there. So this is just showing the calling phase through highlighting. The third principle of Mayer's I think is important when considering visuals is called spatial contiguity. What that means is that we should keep a text close to the illustration that it's describing. So again, here's the same API example shown, but it's displayed slightly differently. As you can see, I've taken the components or the text further away from the visuals, and it makes it a little bit harder to decipher. You have to read the text, and then process the visual. It takes much longer for our brains to process that information. Here's a second example, just in case you were getting bored with my API one. In this visual, I'm explaining data partitioning or data sharding. So again, here you'd have to read through all 4 steps, and then in your brain, map those to the numbers that are displayed in the visual. In contrast to this, where we're bringing the text much closer to the thing that it's explaining, This is the same data partitioning visual, but the viewer here doesn't have to spend time deciphering the different components because they're labeled close to where they're being described. And then a few recommendations when you're thinking about spatial contiguity is consider scrolling and how this might impact the image. For larger processes, break text into smaller chunks and place the text near the part of the graphic that it describes, as we've seen here. Given the limits of attention and working memory on multimedia, learning materials need to moderate the amount of essential processing required by learners. So considering spatial contiguity is one way to do this. The takeaway here is simplify and make explicit connections between informative text and visuals. While bad visuals interfere with a learner's ability to build connections between new information and prior knowledge, good visuals simplify complex concepts, they highlight key concepts to reinforce the point you're trying to make, and they make explicit connections between words and the text. So on to the final section of my talk, which is around selecting visuals based on use case. So I like to think that one size or one screenshot does not fit all. And I'll run through, based on Mayer's recommendations, what type of visual to use for different use cases. So starting with the first example, and a common one we're probably all familiar with, a screenshot. So these are useful for facts or specific forms, screens, equipment. Screenshots should also take advantage of the previously mentioned principles, so coherence, signaling, spatial contiguity. So here again, I'm really emphasizing and signaling with that red text box and the arrow. The text is nice and close to the field that we're describing. And because there's often a lot of information going on in screenshots, really think about where you want to direct users' attention to the critical takeaways and what you're trying to share. For concepts, show examples and non-examples or analogies. Here again, I'm using highlighting also. So this is an example of an analogy or an example and a non-example. And then here's an analogy. So we use so many different analogies in technology to help users map complex processes to something that they already understand. And we can continue to take advantage of analogies when teaching specific concepts and creating connections between them. So just want to draw or thread the needle here. In contrast to our roller coaster example from earlier, be explicit about the analogy and why you're using it. The analogy should be connected to the point you're trying to get across. And really, again, think about cognitive interest over emotional interest. For processes, show stages and where there is motion, animated diagrams. For procedures, show step-by-step tables or demonstrations. And there's even some research that shows that animated procedures support better learning of step-by-step information, especially for software procedures. So here is an Excel diagram showing how to add a button. And that same research actually showed that still images were better for recall, though. So consider when you might want to use animation and when you might want to use a still image. For principles, show guidelines or varied context example. So here's varied context example. And the key takeaway here is that while bad visuals can hinder learning, we shouldn't give up on visuals entirely. You can illustrate so much information and it'll lead to better learning outcomes. So you can move beyond the screenshot and illustrate facts, concepts, procedures, and not just screens. In summary, bad visuals are not benign. They have a negative effect on the learner. Simplify and make explicit connections between informative text and visuals. And you can illustrate so much information, so take advantage of that. Finally, I just wanted to end on a bit of a hopeful note here. So I know when you're phrasing sort of like some of the negative things to do and looking at positive examples, it can feel a little bit daunting. How am I going to be able to integrate this on top of everything else that I have to do? But in bridging the gap between theory and practice, I would encourage you to be open to creativity in the design and delivery of documentation. It can be easy to despair at the amount of work to be done to create good documentation, and I certainly don't want to leave y'all with what feels like yet one other thing to add to your plates. I do want to say that in considering these evidence-based ways to help users learn, be open to creativity in design and delivery of good documentation. Experiment, just like we do with text. Iterate and improve your visuals as you gather more information, and think about how you can inform or include evidence into your documentation, or these evidence-based ways to better design visuals into your documentation. Thanks, y'all, and special thanks to Richard Mayer, whose theory has informed a lot of the talk here. And thank you to all the volunteers and the staff at Write the Docs for helping put on this conference. Oh. And if you're interested in more learning science discussions, I think there's a session in the unconference later that Bonnie John is running. So lots more. It's the last session of the day. Yeah. Cool.
All right. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Please have a seat. We've got some really great questions from the audience today. I'm going to start off with this one, and I think it's it has a lot of value in tech writing. Do you have any advice on making visuals accessible for people who have visual disabilities?
There's lots of tools that are available online to check like contrast. Another thing to consider, and something that came up in the unconference session Bonnie and I ran yesterday, is sometimes GIFs or movement can be difficult to process. So I would just say consider those things and look at what tools are available to test your visuals as well. Quick tests like contrast can make a big difference.
Yep. Thank you. There's a question here about some of us document software that changes frequently, and nothing terrifies writers more than that. How do you suggest following the principles in your talk today while also keeping maintenance manageable?
Yeah, that's why I wanted to get away from encouraging screenshot visuals, because I think there's a lot more that you can visualize that's evergreen, like procedures, those examples, non-examples, like principles, core concepts. So I certainly wouldn't encourage that everything becomes a screenshot of the user interface, so that you have to update that every time there's an evolution. But think about what are the evergreen pieces of information that you can add visual aspects to.
Yeah, I think just as a follow-on, then I'm just thinking you've also obviously written a lot of, or documented instructor or training courses. Do you think that the kind of deliverable that you have, like it's a user guide or an API documentation, as opposed to something that's more training, does that sort of affect your decision of what sort of screenshots or visuals you have in the actual deliverable?
Yeah, I would say yes and no. In my observations of documentation, we tend to rely on screenshots for the visual explanations. And I just would encourage folks to consider, like, is that necessary? Are we showing a procedure? Or are we just showing a button, which could be explained by text? And really think about like visualizing and simplifying different components of the information you're sharing.
Yeah. Thank you. So Katie's got a question about asking us someone easily caught up in interesting seductive details. I like that word, by the way.
Yeah, it's a pretty fun term, right?
Do you have any go-to rules of thumb for deciding what to trim out and how much to pare down?
Yeah, I would say seductive details are, like, as we were saying, a very fun term, but really think about like that API meme example. Think about things that you're adding in that are like funny or tangential, the visual should be really connected with the point that you're trying to drive home. And if it's like a goofy gif of like goat or whatever, it might be related to your documentation if you're writing about like animal husbandry, but probably not. So for the folks in this room, so yeah, I would just really think about like don't try again to like drive emotional interest. I think that that's where people get caught up in seductive details, is they're saying like, this is hard, and then they put a picture of somebody like looking really like difficult in it, as opposed to saying like, this is hard and here are the steps to overcome it, and then visualizing those steps.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. I've got a question. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly scroll through. Just want to make sure. Yeah, okay. So there's a question here from Michael about the cognitive load and the interest and focus. They work very differently for neurodivergence and neurotypicals. Can you talk of some of these differences for various learners?
I can't talk with enough expertise on the differences between neurodivergent folks and neurotypical folks in terms of cognitive load. Yeah. However, I would say for all learners, working memory is limited. Mm-hmm. So that concept, I think, of thinking through how much processing someone can do is pretty broadly applicable.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think we might have we've got time today, so a couple of questions here. Can you give us an example of an emotionally interesting visual versus a cognitive interesting visual in technical documentation? Yeah, I'm a bit curious about this too.
Oh, goodness. I really tried to avoid dragging any technical documentation in my talk, so I didn't include too many like near examples. Actually, I'm thinking about one from, an example from a previous employer of mine is we had an inside joke around Rickrolling. And so some of our apps would walk through, or some of our examples would walk through that, and then they would include like a link to the like Rickroll song. And I think that was really fun, but ultimately like what I remember and what the takeaway was like, oh, this is funny and I'm like getting Rickrolled, as opposed to like, wow, I really like understand how that application worked, or this is something I could then apply to something else. So yeah, the thing that I remember most is the Rickroll, and I completely forget about everything else. So it makes for like a funny example, but when the aim is to help somebody build an application, you don't want them to take away that you're like silly necessarily, or you're being tricked.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Probably just time for one more question. So a question from Nick. Sometimes I remember where on a page information is rather than the information itself. If docs do this, would you consider them successful?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, so I'll read it. I don't know if Nick's here. Okay. Yeah, all right, Nick, you can ask the question. Is that?
I'll remember visually, the answer to this is here.
Yeah.
I orient myself based on the visuals and cues in
Yeah.
my mind.
Yeah.
When docs do this and people remember where to find the information rather than the information itself, is that desirable? Does that make good documentation or not?
I think so. I think it also depends on what your goals are of like learning or takeaways. My thought on documentation is that it should operate on an information in the world as opposed to information in the mind. So I think using good documentation, we do a lot of this stuff in text already through things like signaling, through bullet points, through summative banners. We do a lot of it in text, and I really think that there's opportunity to do more of the things that we know how to do well in visuals. So the short answer is yes, dear. And I would say to like the longer answer is that we're doing a lot of these things well, and we can do them in visuals in a way that helps learners remember those key things and not get distracted by other details along the way. And I think knowing where to find things is a really important approach to like navigating documentation and also to working these days.
Yeah, I guess it all. Sorry, did you have? Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Thanks,
I think
Nick.
it's in terms of what you said, there's just more the familiarity of where to find information, that consistency.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay, thank you. So yeah, thanks, Caitlin. Thanks for your talk today, and you'll be around if people have more questions. So
Yeah,
if you do
definitely.
cite her, I know what I did there, visual site, but if you do see her anywhere, feel free to go and say hello. Yeah, thank you again today for your talk today, Caitlin.
Well,
very
thank
much.
you. Thanks all.